Thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to the first webinar on mental health in our series Doing Safety Differently. This is a co-hosted webinar with the Safety Institute of Australia and Ernst & Young, and we are very happy to have you join us today. My name is Andy Santos. I'm a partner at Ernst & Young and lead our health, safety and environment practice, and I'm going to be facilitating the conversation today. I have joining me today three guests who will help explore the topic of mental health. The first person joining me at the very end here is David Ninnis. He's the Group Head of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at Westpac. Thank you, David, for coming today.
Thanks, Andy.
David is responsible for strategic development and management of key people risks at Westpac. He has a broad range of experience that spans risk management, insurance, safety and wellbeing. And I'm really pleased that he could join us today to discuss what some of the initiatives are that they've been driving through Westpac. I also have sitting here to the left of me Justin Napier, who is the General Manager of Regulatory Operations at Comcare. Justin heads Comcare's Regulatory Operations Group and is responsible for overseeing the WHS regulations. Thank you again, Justin, for joining us as well.
Thanks, Andy.
As the regulator, you're responsible for delivering risk-based, cost-effective and consistent national regulations. So it'll be very interesting to learn from you the views in terms of mental health and wellness as well. Finally, last but not least, thank you, Lucy Brogden, for joining us today as well. Lucy is the Mental Health Commissioner and the Chair of the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance, I should say. And you have been focusing on this area for a number of years.
That's right, Andy.
It's great to have your insights and experience, both personal and professional, here today. Obviously, 25 years of experience working with a range of organisations, sort of hands-on commercially, but also 10 years as an org psych, so some clinical expertise in there as well. Great to have you here, great to have everyone on board. I would like to start by introducing the topic a little bit. Today is all about mental health, but when we talk about mental health, there's a very broad spectrum that we can talk about. And in preparing for today's webinar, we did have a discussion around where the focus should be. And where we landed is that we really want to talk about mental wellness. Those cohort of people who are not so ill that they're not at work, those people that actually want to make sure stay well and stay productive in a meaningful way at work. So throughout today's discussion, I will be using the word mentally well or mental wellness. That's not to say we're not interested in questions around mental ill health or mental health overall, but our focus is very much the people who are well rather than those who might be in clinical care. If I just bring up the next slide, I want everyone to know we are running a Twitter, Twitter conversation, and you can use the hashtag SIA Webinar to send us your comments, but also to send us questions throughout the session today. And we will look to try and answer those towards the end of the session. So please get excited and use the Twitter hashtag for us. As I said, we've got the panellists here specifically to answer the questions. If I lead into the first question, we're talking really about risk and opportunity. And as I said, there's a broad spectrum around mental health. But one of the things that we found in our EY report around mental health is 1 out of 5 people at any point in time aren't mentally well. So that's 20% of our workforce in any given year, which leaves 80% of our workforce that we're trying to keep well. But what we've also learned is about 80% of our workers believe they could be better, they could be more productive if we had proactive approaches to wellness and wellbeing. So with that sort of introduction, I'd like to start with a question to you, Lucinda, which is really looking at what you are seeing as the key risks and benefits around mental wellness, and what you believe organisations gain by addressing that area.
Well, that's a very broad question, Andy, but let's start at the top. And I think if we look at this, as organisations, as employers, we have a legal obligation to look after our employees, and we will come to that. So I'll look more at the the good business perspective and the moral obligation we have to care for one another in our workplace. The business case is supported quite rigorously, and there's been good analysis done that shows that, you know, for every dollar we invest, there is a very positive and meaningful return. But that's just a reason for doing it. It's not the main and the compelling reason to do it. We know it's good business to look after our people. We know that by looking after people, we're able to attract better talent. We can engage staff more. More engaged staff are more productive staff, which is in turn flows through to the bottom line, and that's important. But we also see better ability to engage with suppliers, because increasingly suppliers have greater expectation on the way their companies that they interact with look after staff. So it's becoming quite a comprehensive package of reasons to do that, to look after the well-being of our employees. We also see measures that are often tricky to capture in the true business sense around the costs of things like absenteeism and presenteeism. And these are real numbers that flow to the bottom line, but they're not always headline numbers in the P&L to recognise, but they can be managed. And at the end of the day, it's our reputation. And for a lot of us, you know, it's that front page of the financial review test that we have to pass every day. It's our ticket to doing business. And if we're failing that, we're failing quite comprehensively in business. So the arguments are strong, whichever angle you like to take. I think the attractive thing for business is that this isn't a hard project to embark on. This isn't rocket science. This is about looking at people as individuals, taking a person-centred approach to your employees, and really thinking about their well-being going forward.
You mentioned a couple of, I guess, business imperatives around why mental wellness is important and why a focus on well-being is important. In your experiences, do business, I guess, understand those imperatives? Are they fully aware of the productivity impacts and the opportunities they can gain?
I think businesses are consistently growing in their knowledge base. A lot of the organisations I meet with and talk to say that they understand their obligations, that they have an obligation, they're just not sure what to do. And I think that goes for a lot of us in the community generally when it comes to issues around mental health, mental illness, is we've lifted the stigma a lot, and the rate, we're reducing stigma, I should say. We can talk more openly about it, but it's going to that next step of what I can do. And we know that for people that are struggling in life, work is actually an important part of recovery, and it's an important part of our well-being. We need something meaningful to do, and for most of us, that meaning comes from work. So we need to create a good environment for that.
Okay, thank you. David, within Westpac, we know you've been focusing on well-being, and there's been a, I guess, initiative around that now for a while. How did you build the buy-in to focus on well-being, and what results have you seen from the initiative?
Good question, Andy. And I guess that from the outset, building buy-in for us has not been a challenge by virtue of the fact that there's an appetite there to start with. Okay. So very fortunate in that sense. But in saying that, the very first stage of our journey has been to identify our stakeholders to start with. Who does this impact? I'll go back to Lucy's point. There's an ecosystem or a microcosm that impacts all aspects of society. So as you go through each of those stakeholder mapping exercises and identify what their needs are, that then informs your approach. In the banking sector, we touch in excess of 11 million Australians. So the reality is we're not necessarily seeing it only in our employee pool, but we're also seeing it in our customer pool. Also then, is we start to look at CSR and others and our ethical duties. We see it in that as well. And so the buy-in has been there by virtue of the fact that your stakeholder pool is so wide. I think the other aspect is breaking the myths associated with this as well is also an important aspect, or even to some extent testing hypotheses. Now, I would always say that you will see mental illness take place in the workplace, but that in itself is a myth. You have to create a safe environment for people to disclose, people to be able to share. People to be able to share that we're not just talking about mental illness, we're also talking about the positive aspects. I want to be better today than I was yesterday. So it's that strive and that growth mindset opportunity that's also before us as well. I think also the other aspect is we've seen a bit of an evolution in the workplace in the sense that for some time there, people wanted to attach a label to this. People wanted to call it depression. People wanted to call it anxiety. Again, the approach that we've taken is be better tomorrow than you are today. And I think that that's a fundamental aspect of understanding what role people play. The expectation is not for people to be clinicians. It's the expectation to be human. And I think that's also an important part as we look at roles and responsibilities. You know, I can bang on for hours about the evolution of the safety profession as such.
Please don't.
And I won't for the sake of time, but I guess that for so long in the safety profession, many people have hit people with the big stick of regulatory burden and you must do and must do. The reality is that if you don't, what's the cost attached to that? And I think that's the question we need to be asking ourselves as a profession, but then also as businesses, and back to Lucy's point. I think finally, two other aspects that have been really important to us about building buy-in and making sure we've harnessed buy-in has been giving everybody the opportunity to articulate our approach, to put into their words, to share their stories. An old CEO used to say to me, don't ask the question you don't want the answer to. In this situation, we need to have the courage to ask the question, but also to hear the answer. And I think that's where you build buy-in. As you start to open and lift that stigma, as Lucy said, you actually do open the conversation and open an opportunity to connect with your workforce unlike you have ever seen before. And I think that is how we built buy-in at Westpac.
And through the initiatives that you've run and with that ethos of being better tomorrow, what's been the result? What's been the outcome? What's been the feedback from not just your workforce, but potentially your customers?
Look, we're certainly a far way off from completing the journey. I'd argue that do you ever complete the journey, but that's another argument for another time. I think that the results we're seeing above everything else is firstly, thank you from our workforce. We're hearing resoundingly, I come and shelter this part of my life. Now I have the opportunity to talk about it. Westpac, we've recently done our engagement survey, so I eagerly await the results from that to see whether we can also see similar themes take place there. But I think it's the candour and honesty that we've been able to see above everything else, and people thanking us for the opportunity to create that safe environment where they can share, and back to what Lucy said, preserve an important part of their life, and that is their work identity.
That's great. And a huge part, again, in our report into mental health, one of the key areas we found is creating that community. Quite often, to remain well and to remain connected, you need that sense of community at work, people who you can share your troubles with, and perhaps in the past we haven't focused on that. So again, a core part of what you're doing has created a sense of community where people feel they can have the discussion.
I think it's also just not sharing the troubles though. I think it's back in that philosophy. I just want to be better tomorrow than I am today. I don't need to have problems in order to have the conversation. I just want to be of a mindset that I actually want to improve and go further than I am today. And I think that's fundamentally where in the past, sometimes when we're trying to remove stigma and so forth, we start attaching labels to it. But by doing that, we actually start in my opinion, start to stigmatise it even further. If we start to acknowledge that everybody has their peaks and troughs, let's start from that very homogenous base, first and foremost, so everybody can have the conversation. It's not just confined to the few who are troubled.
Yeah, absolutely. Picking up on the 80% that may not be troubled, but still need that conversation. Justin, if I turn to you and we get a different perspective from a regulator, what are some of the key trends that you've seen emerge around mental wellness, and can you share any examples of events or experiences from a Comcare perspective?
Sure, thanks Andy. Let me start with some statistics to put
some
framework around this. So in the Comcare scheme, of the accepted claims that we manage, 15% relate to mental stress. But when you look at the cost of managing those claims to the scheme, it's about 38%. And last 14-15, the average cost of an accepted claim was $288,000 in our scheme. So we're talking significant amounts of money, and it's obviously it's a huge challenge for the regulator and for the entities to manage this piece of work. Having said that, though, there is some good news, and there's the average cost of claims just 12 months earlier was about $338,000. So it's come down a bit, which seems to suggest that there's better management of claims, both within the entities and perhaps through the insurance and the regulation side at Comcare. Average costs of claims have fallen every year since 2012-13, and the incidence of accepted claims have fallen by 20% since 2010 and 11. So that's the backdrop. We are seeing employers are starting to identify and address mental stress in the workplace much earlier in the piece, and we think that that is a key contributor to better performance across the scheme. If you look at the actual causes of mental stress claims, work pressure is the largest mechanism for injury. And when you start to unpack that, you turn to factors that influence work pressure, such as reducing or managing excessive workloads, addressing challenging work hours, shift work in some cases, excessive overtime, effectively managing workplace conflict, monitoring the job roles, and particularly those with high emotional demands. So that's some areas where there's exposure to traumatic events. Workplace or occupational violence come into that as well. And really importantly, I think effective management of change in the workplace. We see there's a correlation between poor management of change and the claims. So I think what this means is that if we can support and effectively manage the people in the workplace without them needing to take extended leave, or we can encourage them to get back to work sooner rather than later, then that's a good result for both the employer and for the employees. We need, I think, support needs to be provided, and I think that picks up David's point and Lucy's too, and it needs to come from across the board. It needs to be an environment. I think you talked about a community at work. I think that's a really important piece. And I think there's been evolution and understanding in that space, and perhaps that's contributed to some of the better performance we've seen as well. We also think that often there's, I think, some confusion or some concern that sometimes people have a mental illness or stress-related issue that's private nature, and picking up some of the themes earlier, they bring that into the workplace, and sometimes managers go, "Oh my God, I don't want to touch this. I'll make the matter worse. I'll interfere." There's a concern in that space. So I think there's been a bit of a trend in recent times that there's an acceptance that the workplace has an obligation to manage and help manage some of those issues when they enter the workplace too. So, the triggers for mental stress can be, there are many relationship breakdowns, death of friends, loved ones and the like. They do sometimes enter the workforce, and then it becomes an issue for the employer and for the business to manage. So there's a growing awareness in that space.
And it's a real grey area, I think, when we start talking about people who are facing challenges outside of work but have to come to work, and you start to know, well, who's responsible? And a number of clients that I've spoken with would say, well, they're not work-related issues. I said, but the impacts are on their work and the productivity that they bring to work. So it's in your interest to support, take action, and help these people manage what's happening so they can contribute more meaningfully. I just want to pause there and say, if you have questions in the audience, please do use the Twitter tag SIA Webinar and send through your questions so that we can ask them through the session. Please, we haven't had too many yet, but I'm keen to see some come through. But Justin, back to what you were saying that we still see mental stress as one of the key contributors to claims. And when you delve into that, it's work pressure, workload, work hours. Some might say, well, is the issue mental wellness, or is the issue more around good work design? How can we use the principles of good work design or frameworks around how we work to actually address some of what we see?
Well, I think we can use good work design to analyse the nature of the issue. When you're talking mental stress, I think often there are contributors in the workspace. There's some really useful material that the Safe Work Australia on the Safe Work Australia website in relation to this that I think can help to sort of unpack the issue. I think good work design needs an organisational approach. The organisation needs to have a think about the demands of the job, understand the workloads on employees, have a look at the work patterns, some of the work environmental issues. You need to understand also the sort of levels of control. I think that's a really important piece that contributes to people's wellness at work. How in control of their role do they feel? How much say do they have in their workplace? I think is another contributor there. I think there's an opportunity for organisations to consider the support that they provide to their employees, line managers and colleagues, but across the business as a whole. And an effective management system needs to be embraced across the organisation, but often the intersect is with the line manager, and perhaps David and Lucy can talk a bit more about that. Relationships are really important in organisations too, and good work design gives us an opportunity to review those relationships and to adjust work relationships, work arrangements, so that we can minimise any impact that those relationships might have on the employee. Some of the behaviours in the workplace too, you need to be aware if there are any sort of, dare I say, toxic behaviours or any sort of negative behaviours, and they do need to be addressed immediately. And because if they don't, they tend to hang around and create a work environment that's not conducive to mental wellness. Role clarity, I think, is another area of concern, that people sometimes aren't clear about what the expectations of a role are. Sometimes they change on a daily, perhaps even an hourly basis, and for some people that's a cause for some distress and change as well. So how do you manage change in the organisation? How do you engage with your workforce? How do you take them on a journey and have them as part of the solution to an issue in the workplace? So when you're thinking good work design, you can approach it by doing an evaluation piece, I suppose, that looks at a number of those issues, and where you've got concerns or where they're throwing up challenges that are resulting in people being unsettled in the workplace, that may contribute to them not feeling totally engaged with the workplace. There's opportunities through good work design to start to respond to those issues. So that's the good work design piece. As I say, if people are interested in learning more, there's some really helpful, I think, information on the Safe Work Australia website.
Okay, thank you. Picking up on some of what Justin was talking about, Lucy, and thinking about ambiguity, change, I guess building relationships within the workforce and that sense of community. What advice can you give some of our audience and some of the organisations who are taking their first steps, where this is perhaps jumping a little bit into the unknown? It's clearly not black and white, straightforward. What would you suggest?
I think the not black and white and not straightforward is kind of the myth around a lot of this, and I think there is some nervousness and trepidation because we've got the word mental in there, and we're a bit scared of how do we deal with mental health issues, what are the consequences, what if I do the wrong thing? And so that concern comes from quite a good place of I don't want to do the wrong thing, I don't want to do harm. But what we know is that inaction actually will do a lot more harm than action. And probably most of the things you would intuitively be drawn to do are the right kind of things to do. We look at change management projects, and the literature is pretty consistent that most change management projects 80% fail.
Yeah.
And they fail on the people side. So we do a lot at the top management and the leadership level, and we follow all the models that you choose to look at with leadership buy-in, communication strategies, but we fail to talk to the individuals that are at the centre of that change. So there's a lot around the consultation with people, explaining the change, explaining the value of change, why it's happening. Are they external factors that have changed our industry, or is this a merger, an acquisition, an integration? What's going on, so that they understand where the end game is going to take them, and allow them to be part of that conversation. In terms of job and work design, again, you know, as an organisational psychologist, I'd like to tell you that there's, you know, this is scientific and tricky, but a lot of it is quite intuitive around the hours that we expect people to work. And we know, you know, the value of sleep. So long days just don't make sense if you want people's well-being to be well looked after, and if you want them to be productive at the level that you've hired them to be capable of doing. So it's thinking about that person and taking a person-centred approach to management. I think the other area that we need to really work on, that is probably the harder part, is to appreciate the investment in line managers. And I look at a number of companies and they spend a lot of money on their executive development programs. They do great work sort of inducting new staff, but those line managers often get promoted into levels of human responsibility without the skills that go with having difficult conversations, managing different personalities in the workplace. And I think if we can really train up our line managers, we would see a lot of these issues start to diminish. Stress in and of itself is not a bad thing. And we actually have healthy levels of stress around the workplace and tension, and that leads to great creativity. It's when our line managers are ill-equipped to manage that level of stress that we see the wheels start to come off.
Yeah. And I guess reflecting on some of what you've said just reinforces what Justin said, that if we're really serious about it, we need to look at how we go about our work and consider what work we're doing and who's doing it, and the delegations around authority and decision making. Picking up on your comment, does people like to have a sense of autonomy if they can, and a sense of certainty? So change in and of itself isn't bad if I have a clarity around why we're going through it and what will come out the other end. Thank you. If I throw to you, David, and picking up on this concept of good work design, and in my years of experience, the health and safety professionals don't typically design the work, or not all of it, although we try every now and then. So if we look at responsibility for mental wellness within the business, from your perspective, from an industry perspective, where do you think that really lies, and how do we resource and influence within our organisations to improve?
Andy, it's a simple answer to start with, and I'll delve into the detail. The first of which, everyone's got a responsibility, full stop. Why? Because, going back to what Lucy said, humanity first and everything else second. Now that's more than just philosophical. We've come through a time when our approach to mental ill health and otherwise has been to try and train managers to be pseudo-clinicians. That does not fundamentally work. Then we try to adopt, many moons ago, an opportunity for safety practitioners to put an 8-page checklist in front of somebody and stop dealing with the person, stop having an authentic conversation with the person. I guess that our role as leaders is to lead. And often that's about, firstly, at times being vulnerable, recognising that we suffer from the same peaks and troughs that the people that work in our organisations do. I think also the other aspect is we spend a lot of time in many sectors training for IQ. We need to really work on EQ. We really need to work on empathy. We need to work on understanding. I think that personal responsibility is also something that you can't shirk either. Every one of us, I am responsible for my health and my wellness, my mental state at any one point in time. And I recognise that. And I look forward to the opportunity to discussing that with people around me. Now, it's taken a long time to get to that point, but that's a sort of a safe environment that we have to establish where we can talk about it. I have a peer network. My peers play a big role in my mental health. It's me recognising that, but then also for them to recognise that as well. And I think that's, there's no greater example, I think, and there was a Harvard study done, the 75-year study of relationships, and basically looking at those people who lived longer for one particular reason, their relationships and positive relationships. We can't downplay that. I think certainly regulators have a role to play. It's reassuring and refreshing to hear that there's a recognition from Justin that it is multifaceted. Again, if we were to rewind the clock some 10 years ago, all you would hear is from certain regulators saying, well, you created this problem, and not an understanding that a person's well-being can be different from everyone else. And recognising that the triggers for me are different to Lucy's and different to Justin's and different to your own. And I might be able to sustain or actually thrive in an environment of a high level of stress relative to others, or a lower level of stress. I think there's also an organisational opportunity as well, and the organisation plays a large role. I'm very fortunate to work for an organisation that embraces individuality, embraces identity. But I think that a leadership position by the organisation and that loyalty as well also gives you a sense of courage and empowerment to be able to talk about issues such as what we're talking about today. There is one caveat in roles and responsibilities, and the caveat is also then that of critical incidents. When it does head into uncharted territory or heads into territory that is dangerous, then expert support cannot be downplayed. It's not at that point in time a matter of striking up a conversation in a meeting 3 weeks from now. Times of the urgency, and I guess I look at Lucy as a practitioner to say it is absolute times of the urgency, but again, don't let the humanity be lost in the situation. Almost listening to Lucy talk and Justin just talk now, there's this phrase I've literally just jotted down saying that, particularly around work design, it's almost this concept of genetic work design. I design my work purposeful for me. And I guess, again, I'm very fortunate to work in an organisation that allows me to do that. The hours aren't 9 to 5. The hours are when I'm most productive. And giving me the opportunity to do that. I think we all have a role to play in that. But let's not downplay personal responsibility and understanding about yourself.
Okay. Picking up on one of your comments, Abby, you said the role of the regulator. I'm going to throw to you, Justin. Can you answer? What do you see as the regulator's main role in regards to this area?
Yeah, compliance is an obligation. The WHS Act, the Work Health and Safety Act, puts the onus for compliance on the entities that are regulated. Where we come in, we need to enforce compliance, we need to investigate where there are events that are of concern, but I think also the regulator has a role in enabling and empowering and assisting organisations that we regulate to take responsibility of their own volition. So whilst the Act has quite strident penalties in it, I still see the role of the regulator as contributing to a better workplace practice and providing access to information, support, guidance and the like to assist in that space. That's an interesting position to be in, where we straddle sort of two sides of the equation. And when we do go into a workplace and we do follow up on an event or a notification or a circumstance in the workplace, we do need to put on the regulator hat, and there are a series of steps that we'll take to form an assessment, if you like, of whether there were effective controls and whether the risks of mental wellness or lack thereof are being effectively managed. So it's an interesting space to be in, but the Act is absolutely clear. And whilst, picking up what I was saying earlier, while sometimes the trigger might be in the home environment, once it reaches the workplace, the employer does have responsibilities in that space. And it's our job to be, we're part of the equation, I think, and it very much is dependent on the entities to take that responsibility in the first instance. And I'm thrilled to hear the Westpac experience and some of Lucy's insights, because that's really where we'd like to see, the community going, and it makes our job a lot easier as well.
And I think the regulator, if I can step in, also has a great perspective, because they've got all the good data and they can really help organisations see where they're slotting in. Are you top quartile performance or are you not? And help them with that data, because data, some people like to say if you can measure it, you can manage it. And I think we've hopefully moved beyond that mantra to actually realising that may have held in the 80s, but we've moved on. But at the same time, we're competitive by nature, so we kind of, we are motivated by where we rank, but we can see what best practice looks like, who's working well, who's not, who's managing their claims well, who's not. And that's starting to produce some really useful tools back in the workplace around managing claims, managing processes that we've often been in the dark around.
I think to that point though, and Lucy used a key word there for me, that is data. You're right, the regulators do have a wealth of data, but often it's data after the fact.
Yeah.
I think that one of the projects certainly we've been heading down is this notion of predictive analytics and otherwise to be able to try and predict what is ending up in just in space,
yes.
what's ending up at that point, what are the precursors leading into it. And I think that's a really exciting stage of our evolution, but also harnessing the technology that sits behind it. I think that what we need to do better as an industry is actually sit with the regulators and say, I've got all this lead data, you've got all this lag data, let's get the two to talk to each other. I think that's the opportunity that we've got before us now. That I would say that we haven't necessarily harnessed as yet, but I think there's a growing appetite too.
Talking about data, because there's a couple of questions from the audience in that sort of vein. One is from Chelsea, sort of picking up directly from what you've said there, David, because Chelsea's asking, other than surveying, how do we identify potential issues or emerging issues, which I think's touching a little bit on the predictive that you're talking about. Do you want to delve into a little bit more there for Chelsea in terms of how to go about getting a sense of your profile and the risks there?
Absolutely. Look, I think it's, again, we've invested a lot of time and resources into understanding this. We've taken all our lag indicators and lag data, so those stress events that have happened, but looked at the 12-month, 24-month horizon prior to that. What were the behaviours we were seeing through data at that point in time? Were we seeing absence? Were we seeing consecutive absence? Were we seeing single-day absence? Were we seeing absence without medical certificate or with medical certificate? Were we seeing email send times of 3 a.m. and midnight? Were we actually seeing quite the opposite, which is what we actually observed? That 9 to 5 seemed to be the problem.
Yeah.
We were able to stack up 174 different variables and look at 3.1 million correlations between them to try and predict, based on demographic details, age, race, job role, the list goes on, relative to behavioural indicators as well, and also some hard facts, and look at what did we see for those outcomes that we know resulted in distress. Okay, great. What did we see for those that we know that were flourishing and high achieving? And certainly the view is it's polarizing. But what we do have now is almost a roadmap or an ingredients list to understand how can we supplement and not substitute, but supplement a leader observing physical cues and signs and also intuition about their team and knowing their team with some data in the backdrop to understand, again, both sides of the coin though, not just distress, but also when they flourish.
And it's a really interesting point because Chelsea has asked, other than surveying, and in my experience, surveying is not a reliable form. People are not very good at self-reporting their mental health, especially if they're not healthy. Lucy, any thoughts from you in terms of how we might get a sense of who within our workforce is needing support or is at risk?
I actually would prefer people to take the view that we are all at risk, because I think we do all carry vulnerabilities and we bring different things into the workplace that none of us will ever foresee. Death in the family is a trigger. You can't manage for that, but you can have an attitude of compassion and empathy and support, and you can create a culture within your workplace that says that we will wrap around this person and give them the support that they need. We have a lot of talk about flexibility in the workplace as though it's a thing that you bolt in. It's a real mindset to be a flexible thinker, to be open to new ideas, to be open to opportunities. And that's the sort of messaging we need to give line managers every day, that they need to be open to what comes to them and then allow some creativity around that thinking so that we can manage for that. I actually think it would be terrible if we were surveying for mental illness, because I think that just brings us back down the stigma curve. We need to be creating an environment that is open to whatever the issues might be. But if we're looking for it, then we look for the risk factors in our job and work design and the job analysis that we're doing. And we can see, we know what the triggers are. Is this position a role that has high demands and low control? We know that that's going to create risk. What can we do? We may not be able to tweak the demand side. Inherently, that's just part of the role. But we may be able to find some opportunities to create control. And so it's that sort of thinking and conversation around all the roles. But you can start by knowing where the greatest risk factors might lie and then working your way through the organisation. I think that's a healthy approach to management generally, is to keep looking at the roles and what we're expecting of people in any context, but putting people at the centre.
And if you take that approach, one of the questions from Andrew was, clearly we're seeing an increase in organisations encouraging their workers to take flexible work arrangements, work from home, be mobile. Do we see that as helping or hindering this conversation around creating a safe environment and flexibility? Is it more than just flexibility in terms of the laptop and the next G card? Is it also flexibility and mindset?
Absolutely. I think it should start at flexibility and mindset and allow the technology or whatever it might be to support that solution rather than the other way around, because I think that's when we do start to see the 3 a.m. emails, the weekend emailing, and that might work for some individuals, but it wants to be part of a broader conversation around their job, not kind of extra hours by stealth because they can. And equally, we don't want to be getting too prescriptive around what a work day might look like.
And I think one of the fears as we head into this mobile workforce environment, which is coming, is a breakdown in connectivity with work peers and colleagues who, coming from an environment where you see them every day, and activity with work peers and colleagues who, coming from an environment where you see them every day and there's a face-to-face interaction. How do we counter that? How do we respond to that?
I think we're seeing it already. A lot of people are opting to come back to the office. They choose to have the options for flexibility and working from home or somewhere else when they need it, but that social side is actually pulling people back into the workforce. And again, talking to organisations, they're seeing that people are much more present than they were a few years ago, and they're enjoying that and they're feeling more productive. So.
The only caveat I'd offer to that, though, Lucy, is that certainly I think there's a age differential in there.
Yes.
I think it certainly, I can only talk about myself and without divulging too much about my age, it's more of a matter of being able to say that I enjoy that team environment, that work environment, but I choose that environment. Others that are much younger than me actually may not. But I don't also want to get caught in that specific brackets of ages do certain things. I think going back to what you're saying, the flexibility is up to us to exercise, and an organisation to give the freedom to exercise it. But then also to talk about it, because what is flexible for me may not be flexible for you. And if I report to you, what are the expectations attached to that? Yes. So it's the power of the conversation as well as the power of policy combined that I think that ultimately we all need to try and harness and continue for the future.
I think there's an old saying, and it's very true, particularly when we look at this, loyalty is a two-way street. And if you go in demanding or expecting a particular work structure, that's not the right approach. It's that conversation of how do we, as a team of 2, 10, remote or otherwise, make it work. And equally, I think we're very focused sort of in the professional services environment. For some people, that flexibility is not an option. You will be at the plant between this time, and there isn't that flexibility. And that's where you need that creativity around what control can we give people in a very structured environment where flexibility might seem like not possible at all.
So if I pick up on some of that comment, and we're talking about potential differences in styles, Is there any data, Justin, Lucy, I guess looking to you two, is there any data available that gives us some of the demographic insights? Roger in the audience was asking, is there a breakdown, industries that potentially have higher risk or job roles where we're seeing higher risk exposure potentially because of the lack of autonomy or the demands that they face?
I'm not aware of any, but I suspect this problem's widespread. I don't think it's unique to particular subsets or ages or anything.
Yeah.
I think my sense of it is that at any point in time you will come across people within your workforce that are in some stage of distress. And I think picking up the flexibility issue, I think ideally an organisation needs to be able to be flexible in its response. Now, what that means will vary from job to job, and you picked up, in a manufacturing space, or Comcare regulates the defence industry, for instance. So flexibility in that space is an interesting concept. But it's understanding the worker. It's understanding their personal circumstance, and it's, if you like, being flexible and constructing some solution that allows them to ideally resolve the issues themselves with the assistance of the workforce, so that these issues do not sort of escalate from a state of distress into a state of inability to be at work for a period of time to a state where they cannot work again. And this is why in our world a lot of the claim costs are so exorbitant, because for us I think there's a strong correlation between early intervention and treatment and response from the employer and avoidance of that sort of longer term claim. I'll look into the statistics, but I haven't come across any, I'm sorry.
Andy, I think at the high level what we've seen is more by industry. So what we have seen is that those industries from manufacturing industrial background that have had to have a culture and systems around physical safety have found the transition a little bit easier because they've understood managing for risk and they've taken it as a risk management approach. I think at a very general level, those of us in professional services are struggling to see our capacity to change. We've got quite entrenched management structures. Some of them, you might argue, are a little bit archaic in their management approach, which then sort of fails to bring about organisational change in the same way. Having said that, the appetite is there to want to do the right thing. It's just that lack of knowledge, lack of experience that we need to backfill.
But can I say, we've got to be cautious about, again, just always playing into the hand of ill health. Yeah. We've got to be able to create an environment where people can be better or perform at their best. I think that if we go back to the old hierarchy of control, and I'll reinforce the word hold, we go back to hierarchy of control, eliminating the problem up front is a preferred control measure. That's where we need to spend our efforts. That's where we need to be able to get ahead of it, so then it doesn't end up in Justin's book of accounting as such. I think it's vitally important that we invest the time up there. Now, certainly that's not discounting the fact that we have resources or otherwise available to people to respond. And one of the questions there was relating to what resources do we have available to people. Can I say that there are resources that equally apply in some instances to preventative as well as reactive? Because this is not one of those situations that you're waiting for that inevitable physical event to take place. Now, certainly in the banking industry, we have robberies from time to time. That is a physical, frank event. With this type of phenomena that we're dealing with now, we're dealing with a slow burn in some situations. But then, again, that's the reason why I think you need to play to both ends of the spectrum. There's traditional tools available. There's also some more non-traditional or innovative tools that are certainly coming through. And I think we've seen a certain movement in mindfulness start to come through. Now, mindfulness is not a new phenomenon. It's been around for some time. And we've also seen a lot of charlatans peddle mindfulness as well. I think it's a matter of being able to, again, decipher what is appropriate to people, but also empower people to use those tools.
On that, I think there are early warning systems, if you like, and there are a number of tools. And part of the challenge in this space is that I think there's so much information out there and many, many tools, and some of them kind of cannibalise each other. But leave that aside. There are some tools out there that some of which are available for free on the website, and People at Work's one that comes to mind. Heads Up have got some assessment tools, and the purpose of those is to undertake a risk assessment within teams or within organisations. That the intent of them is to bring to the fore some of these issues in the early stages. And picking up David's point, some of it's a slow burn, some of it's immediate, but often it's an aggregation of issues over time that haven't been responded to effectively by the employer. There hasn't been that kind of early intervention, and the consequences of it we see, and it's much better to get in early.
So would it be fair to say that rather than thinking about the demographic of our workforce that are at risk or ill, we should actually just be saying, what is the demographic of our workforce and the type of work they're doing, and how do we get them fitter, better, stronger, more resilient, specific to that demographic? So for example, the way you might engage youth in an office around resilience and fitness and develop them is going to be quite different perhaps to if you have a part of your workforce that are on the factory floor or down a mine pit, that type of thing. So you kind of need to understand the types of work and potentially then respond with targeted approaches rather than something very sort of motherhood across the top.
I think that's probably the reason why we call mental ill health one of the largest challenges in safety.
Yeah.
Is because there is not one size that fits all. It's not a matter of fitting a guard to a machine to prevent someone from entering a certain space. It is multifaceted. It bridges not just from the work environment, personal environments, community environments, the list goes on. I think that's the reason why we are finding this one of the greatest challenges that's being presented to the safety industry in a number of years. I'd like to think that there's an appetite to try and empower people, and I go back to, again, I think I'll use this phrase more and more now, and that is that notion of genetic solutions. The person needs to be able to feel empowered to be able to pick the solutions or pick the activities, pick the coping mechanisms that work best for them. But that has to start from a foundation of understanding. And I think that's what is incumbent on us in organisations, to be able to give understanding, give a suite of resources and tools available to people to help them identify what's most appropriate for them.
I think we've taken a very behavioural approach to safety for a long time, and those that are moving sort of at the pointy end are taking much more of a values-driven cognitive approach to that. And how do we entrench that value for people in the heart of what we do? And if we look back across the history, the Hawthorne studies of 100 years ago asked people what they wanted, and that was more time with family and a guaranteed holiday. So they gave them brighter lights and said, wow, look, they're working a bit better because they've got brighter lights. If you go and ask the employees today, what do they want? Time with family, those opportunities. Nice. And so this, when people sort of make it complicated, it's not that hard. And I think just taking up your point, Andy, we shouldn't assume what people need and want. And it's that what they're doing at Westpac. Ask people what they need and want. And then I do get a bit scared when you see an organisation say, oh, we've started this running initiative and everyone's going to be on treadmills running because that worked for me. And you can see a whole group suddenly disenfranchised going, that is my worst nightmare. Putting the running gear on and running around with my colleagues at work, I would rather be anywhere else but. So,
I think Dave is actually doing one of those initiatives at the moment, Corporate Challenge, walking a lot.
So certainly, but I guess it's picking up on that point. Firstly, there's no mandate. Secondly, the other aspect is recognising that it's not just about physical health. It is again multifaceted. We know that one of the clear treatment modalities for depression is cardiovascular exercise. So there's multiple things that it can address. There is a healthy competitiveness in it, absolutely. But I think also the point is that with our organisation, people opt in, but they also opt in to a program that they want to do. It's not opting in at push. It's creating small communities of people to be able to interact. If the achievement that we achieve from something such as that is better connection, objective achieved.
One of the questions from the audience, and I think this is a challenge a lot of my clients face, is building awareness and understanding around mental wellness and the opportunities as well as the risks at a board level and a senior executive level. And I'm cognizant a lot of our audience today are safety professionals. Probably a question to all of you, and Justin, I might start with you. What are some of the things that an OHS or health professional within an organisation can do to help build executive understanding around this and the steps that should be taken?
I might quote from the Act and some of the penalties that apply in the event that these hazards aren't effectively managed.
Yeah.
Now that's a fairly blunt instrument, but it does tend to focus the mind of some who are not quite getting it within organisations.
Yeah.
But look, putting that aside, I think there are steps that can be undertaken in organisations following sort of risk management principles that will identify the scope of the issue within an organisation and also propose solutions and responses to those risks. So again, safety people will know this, but the Safe Work Australia website has guides to managing work health and safety risks, and it goes through that. Identify the hazards, look at the risks, implement controls and monitor and continue to ensure that those controls are effective. So perhaps tackling the problem at that level was part of it. There's, data is a good way to raise awareness of the issue, particularly with senior management and the cost of claims. I mean, I don't want to keep focusing on that, but it's an enormous investment. It takes a lot of time and energy to manage those issues if they ever get to that point. There are, as I say, some steps that can be put in place early on in the process that ideally mitigate those matters getting to that level. Perhaps getting people in to address the board and outline obligations, responsibilities, but also controls and fixes and articles that come up from time to time demonstrating what the consequences of poor management in this space.
Okay. What about you, Lucy? Any thoughts from your experience? How do we get potentially attention awareness up?
I think my experience is that most boards and senior managers get it. They want to do something. The stick certainly is there, and most, you would hope, are aware of that stick. If you are a safety in a safety role, then I think one of the valuable things is to arrange some time with the senior executive to ask them what they're seeing and thinking, rather than kind of be forever putting scary stories in front of them. Make it a collaborative relationship about how we shift the issues. And it's just on that regulatory framework, we've touched on culture but haven't really talked about organisational culture much. And not only now do we have, we've got a strong regulatory framework in place, but a lot of the adjacent regulators to this space, so APRA, ASIC, Fair Work, are saying, we're going to look beyond just strict compliance and look at your culture. And I can tell you, and you can see it playing out in the media at the moment, looking at culture is exercising boards in terms of, oh dear, it's again one of those intangibles that is a tricky lever for them to manage and to understand where does the responsibility for cultures lie. So,
David, I know you've got a very strong view around culture, but before I give you license to talk about that one, how did you go about, I know you had an invested board already.
Yes.
But what would your advice be to safety professionals in terms of getting their attention and support?
I think you need to go back to, I literally just came across from listening to Robert Kaplan talk, and I guess some of what he says resonates. You need to link back to the values and strategy of the organisation. Yeah. Board members and others have a vested interest in the strategy, values of the organisation, the mission, and they have to protect the interests of shareholders. I think that we need to link into that to demonstrate the opportunity, but the caution I would add is don't just use that lever.
Mm.
I think the other lever that you have, and certainly we have utilised as well, is the power of the story. If you have a person sit down and share their journey in this space, you cannot help but be bought into their journey. You cannot help but understand the journey that they've been on, and how can you help as an individual. Let's not lose the humanity through this. There is certainly a commercial aspect, and I go back to that phrase before that I used, what's the cost if you don't invest in it? But then also coupled with that, there is a massive human element attached to it. I think there's such a distinct opportunity to use the power of story, all of us, and if I was to almost take over moderating, Andy, which I won't do, is to say, if all of us were to share a story about how this has impacted us, I'm absolutely confident we would all have a story. Let's share those stories, because that's the power that we can exercise in this space, is either to stop the story, to share the story, or to react and respond to that person that is in need at that point in time.
And there's definitely been examples. I know some of the organisations, recent presentations, where absolutely the story of one of the exec members has been what's galvanised the exec team to do something and think about things differently. I know that there was, within the construction industry, a lovely story shared where, unfortunately, someone on a site suicided, but it galvanised the site and hence the team to say, we can't accept this, we have to do something. And it is those stories and remembering those stories. We are obviously a storytelling species. We like to learn that way.
I think you also flag a good point, though, is that you flag a point there about we have to do something. The advantage that we have in this space is we all can do something.
Absolutely. You don't need to be trained to ask and show genuine care.
Exactly right, which may be different to some of the other traditional safety risks in which we're dealing with.
Yeah. So if we talk about genuine care, and I'm conscious that we have about 10 minutes before I have to wrap up, but if we talk about genuine care for a moment, because quite often an Are You OK Day is a great example of trying to initiate care. Quite often it is those little things which actually have a big impact on people on the day-to-day. What are some of the support mechanisms, and maybe, from a Comcare perspective, some of your inspectors and people are dealing with quite aggressive circumstances at times as well. So what do we do to demonstrate care to our people, and how do we help them demonstrate care with each other? How do we get them to take that step?
Yeah, both our inspectors can deal with confronting matters, but often the people in the Commonwealth Public Service, for instance, there's a lot of confrontation and trauma and the like in that space.
And a lot of change at the moment.
Oh, change too, certainly, and yes, being in the middle of an election campaign, more change, no doubt, further down the line. But yeah, I think it's about it's that compassion, it's that caring, it's reaching out, it's taking responsibility, I think, for the welfare of others in your work group and beyond. There's debriefs and the like after traumatic events that have proved to be particularly effective in that space. It's that good work design piece again. If you analyse the nature of the work, you can learn a lot about some of the risks that are presented in that space. That helps to identify some of the challenges that people might be facing, and then there's opportunities to adjust the work practices, to job rotate, to it might be resilience training. There's a range of techniques that are there that can be employed in response to that. There's a large piece of work going on in the Commonwealth with people who are in that sort of customer contact space, Centrelink staff and DHS staff and the like that are regularly dealing with aggressive people, and it's been found that there are, that's obviously a contributor to their stress levels that may lead to something else. There are early intervention strategies in that space that can be employed too. So I think it's never a one-size-fits-all. It's about understanding the context of the issue and using the range of sort of techniques and tools, but decency, compassion, caring, understanding, some of those words come into it, and trying to respond on that basis in the first instance.
Okay.
I think following on from that, so one of the interesting examples I've seen recently is that an organisation actually put into their line managers' KPIs that they had to use the manager assist line and count that as a KPI. So for most people, organisations, they have an employee assistance program. Part of that bundle is support for managers in dealing with difficult situations. And to encourage them to use that tool, part of their key performance indicators is to document that they've actually been using the manager assist tool, because we know that conversations are tricky. We don't actually train employees terribly well on the difficult conversation. So to actually encourage and say, getting coaching on this is a positive, we value it, that you are prepared to put your hand up and say, I don't know how to handle or manage this situation, is a positive, I think is an interesting message to take on board. And I think equally, peer support is proving to be very powerful in a lot of industries, and that's something that we can learn particularly from a lot of the caring professions and bring over into others, is that you can have off-the-record peer support conversations around tricky situations and help provide that network of professional support, but in a caring and nurturing way around particularly the vicarious trauma that comes with some roles.
Okay. David, different question for you from Naylan in the audience to this topic of support mechanisms, still on topic, but specifically talking to your Westpac workers, and what are the internal and external support mechanisms that are available to them? You mentioned having a range of things that almost like a self-serve, but what are some of the examples of support mechanisms that are provided?
Again, firstly, it'd be important to leave with the caveat that if we were talking about clinical environments or clinical depression, anxiety and so forth, or critical incident, there is no substitute for expert help. Yep. So park that to one side.
Yep, absolutely.
Notwithstanding that, though, it does need to exist on a spectrum of professional support through to campaign-esque type of support mechanisms. Are you okay? Day others as well, just to try and break down the stigma. In terms of support for our organisation, we run everything from EAP, which includes also then wellbeing coaching and so forth, which also includes, again, where people want to be better at what they do, they can have those conversations. It's not necessarily going there with a problem. Manager assist, which Lucy just spoke of, which truthfully, and I think we'd see this phenomenon across the entire industry, is the most underutilised channel across any, which I find still surprising to this day. I think we're very fortunate to have internal resources across the bank. I've got what I regard as the most amazing team charged with the highest level of care for our people, and they are, again, I cannot sing their praises highly enough about the response that they offer to more than 8,000 incidents per year. I think that's demonstration of care. I think also we've got the opportunity to teaching, and back to what Lucy was saying before, we actually do invest a lot of time and effort in helping people leaders, as we call managers in Westpac, have a conversation. Not necessarily over-engineer it with checklists or otherwise, but rather put them in scenarios and so forth and say, how would you respond to this situation, and coach and guide. I think we've also then got, to pick up on what Justin said before about the multifaceted aspect of distress and stress per se, a number of different programs ranging from those to build greater connection between yourself and your family and community, through to understanding your financial status and how do I improve my finances, through to my values base and how does that align to the organisation, and what opportunities that affords me. I guess that to answer that question, there's much, but it starts with, again, a foundation of knowledge, because we want people to be able to pull the levers that will work for them, or have the courage to pull levers that won't, but nonetheless try it.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we are very much running out of time, so I guess firstly a big thank you to the three of you for giving up your... So I guess firstly, a big thank you to the three of you for giving up your time and participating today. I think it's been very interesting to have the different perspectives and a really diverse sort of representation of the issue. For the audience, thank you very much for all the questions that have been sent through. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them, which is great in some ways, because you always worry that you're not going to get any at all. So apologies to a couple of people at the end there who I haven't been able to answer your questions now. We will close the loop with you after the webinar if you have further questions. Also pointing out that we have a couple of links there up on screen if you want some more resources. Justin did mention the Heads Up org website. The Safe Work Australia website also has some resources. And finally, there are 3 more of these webinars in our series coming up, and those dates are on your screen as well. So we will be doing the next one in June. 22nd of June is going to be around health, safety and organisational culture. Please make sure you join us for that session as well. Finally, I think we've broached a very broad range of things around mental wellness, but I come back to the start. It is a very broad spectrum, and perhaps different approaches required at different ends of the spectrum. I think great consensus across all of us that you do need a bit of data behind you, and you do probably need to think about it holistically as a humanity issue and I guess in some ways the ethical, moral right thing to do first, and then the systems and procedures come and follow that. So again, big thank you to everyone for the content, the input and advice that you've given. Very pleased to have had you here today. And on that note, I think we will call it a wrap. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.